500 years ago, he washed ashore the sole survivor of a shipwreck. And upon the skull of the man who killed his dad, he said, "I'm mad, I must eradicate piracy, injustice and cruelty, and all my sons will follow me, so evildoers will believe that this man cannot die."
The Phantom,
the ghost who walks.
The Phantom,
Enemies beware, the Phantom's always there, but you won't find the Phantom. He finds you.
Melbourne Supanova 2022. Summary of the show from me would be quiet. It was probably half the size of what you would expect from a supernova prior to COVID, but let's not kid ourselves. I'm just happy to be able to get back to a con. It was really great to get out. As I said, half the size, both in terms of number of stalls, area taken up, number of people going. I was there on the Sunday. That could have been had something to do with it, but let's be honest. The reason I was there on the Sunday was to attend the Phantom panel that was held with Maria Lewis from the Phantom Never Dies podcast, Matt Kyme, who is a published Phantom artist and author and also appears on this podcast quite often as a host, and Jamie Johnson, who was meant to be there, Phantom cover artist, but unfortunately had to cancel relatively last minute due to COVID, which was disappointing but understandable as we go through these current times. Spent a fair bit of time hanging out at Matt's stall with his wife Lani, and also had the luck to catch up with Duncan Munro, who, let's be honest, really should have been part of the panel. With Jamie stepping away, it would have been good to hear what he had to say, but got to sit into the panel and listen. It was fairly late on a Sunday afternoon, so it didn't start till about 4 o'clock. It wasn't particularly well attended, but to be honest, it didn't make any difference. It was great to hear what both Maria and Matt had to say, and look, I hope everyone enjoys hearing it.
Matt, how did you first get into the Phantom?
1988.
Oh, yeah, the year ahead.
Oh yeah. It was the beginning of Frew's renaissance, their golden age, where the particular publisher Jim Shepherd was really reaching back and trying to find the classic stories and produce them unedited and uncensored. So I was 8 years old, and I was just lucky that I had family friends with boys who were a little bit older. And whenever I go to their house, they have stacks of Tintin, Asterix, and Phantom comics. And also they had some Marvel and DC, but the Phantom, to me, I don't know why, even just Donald Duck and that kind of stuff. But the Phantom just looked like a character that was relatable, even as an 8-year-old. He didn't have superpowers. He had an interesting collection of supporting cast. Lived in the jungle, like as a kid, just like always loved the jungle, but was terrified of quicksand my whole life.
It's so weird when you're a kid, you think quicksand is going to be such a bigger problem than it ends up being as an adult.
It's disappointing in a way. I mean, surviving is great, but you at least want a few narrow misses. But yeah, that was sort of it for me. I became aware of the Phantom and then started collecting it. And as I said, it was right at this fantastic time in the publication history. Jim Shepherd was finding all these lost gems, all these stories which had been really severely edited in the past. And he'd gone to a lot of effort to get newspaper strips from around the world to fill in the gaps. And those stories to me were so influential in my comic reading, but also in my comic writing. But I might be preaching to the converted because I know just about everyone in the audience. And you?
Well, purple has always been my favourite colour, but I think it is that thing that I always found really interesting, is like how the subtextual becomes textual. So like obviously the Phantom, it's passed on, the mantle is passed from like father to son, etc, etc. And I feel like that's the same thing with the character. It's a thing that often gets passed from father or grandfather onto child. And for me, it was my grandfather. was a massive Phantom fan. I grew up in New Zealand, and so he first got me into the Phantom, and then it was when the Billy Zane movie came out, we went and saw it, and I was just like, oh, because originally it's like you didn't get to see the colours, it was just like black and white, right? So I didn't know the Phantom was purple, and in New Zealand the Phantom is actually, brown, right? It's like a brown and red colour. So then we go to see the movie, we first moved to Australia, and I was like, he is purple, and he's a pet wolf. I was like, oh my god, and then the film obviously does such a great job of having female characters who have like agency and drive and complexity, and like it's a really great sort of I don't want to say expansion, but like adaptation of that first Sing Brotherhood story. And so getting to see
as well.
Exactly, yeah. So getting to see like not only two female characters but agency and drive and ambition, but especially when you got to the end of the film and Sally goes, us girls just stick together, don't you think? I was like, yeah, women! It just was like so cool to me, and it was the movie that was the hook, because the comic was great, and my granddad's passion for it was great, but the film just like captured something.
And did you see it with your grandfather?
Yeah, we saw it like 2 or 3 times on the Gold Coast, not knowing that was where it was filmed. And then I got older and I started out my career as a police reporter and then transitioned into running about film and entertainment. I was like, oh my god, this is where it's filmed? It's crazy. So I was going to do jobs and stuff on like the same location as where the Phantom movie was filmed. I was like, wow, can it get anything better than this? It's spoilers, it can, but it was just like a very exciting moment.
Well, that really resonates with me as well, because my grandfather as well, when I started to bring home comics, and I had some Batman comics and Green Lantern and all this different stuff, and he wasn't particularly interested in any of that. But then when I brought him a Phantom comic, it's like, oh, yeah, I used to read these, this is good,
Yeah.
And so I had this thing for years and years and years. Each fortnight I'd go down to the shop, the Hurstbridge news agency, and I'd have my pocket money, which was $3 a week.
Yeah.
And ordinarily the Phantoms back then were $1.50, but sometimes there was a more expensive one, so I had to save up a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, every fortnight I'd buy one, read it, and then put it on my grandpa's bed, because we all lived together in the same house.
I love that.
And so, yeah.
Oh my god, get your own life!
Yeah. Stop plagiarising my life.
I thought I'd ask you both, is there a particular issue or a storyline that you're quite favourite of? All right, you can talk about that.
Squeaky word.
Second favourite.
Mine is more of a sentimental favourite, I guess. I love the Princess Valerie story from 1947, I believe it is. So it's like one of the really early Phantom stories. But it was this sort of tribute to Valerie Fawkes, so Lee Fawkes' oldest daughter, as her parents were going through a divorce. And the way that, in case nobody here knows, I have this audio documentary about the Phantom called Phantom Never Dies, where we go through sort of like the legacy of the character, but also the pop culture etymology, and look at all the different things in pop culture that have been impacted by the Phantom, even though the Phantom doesn't necessarily have the same brand recognition as things like Buffy or Batman or Star Wars or whatever. But we interviewed Valerie for that, and in talking to her, I was like, Princess Valerie is one of my favourite stories. There's something sweet about like a little girl kind of lost in the jungle, and there's something really, for me anyway, I think the reason I resonated with it is it kind of felt like me and my granddad sort of sharing that story together. And she said it was really interesting about that is Dad wrote that when he and my mum were going through a divorce, and I wasn't getting to see either of them a whole lot because she was a touring actress, her mother. But it was his way when that comic came out of letting her know that he was thinking about her, and I just kind of love that sentimental reason.
Yeah, that's one of my favourites too. And what I like about it as well is the way that the Phantom and Diana treat Valerie is really, really beautiful.
Yeah.
And also I guess the way that it was illustrated as well. I assume that Rainbow would have known Valerie, or would have had some pictures of her at the very least. And so Valerie is this very special character, this very special, beautiful girl in the story who everyone really, really cares about. And the Phantom is so angry at the people that have tried to harm her as well.
Oh, twinsies!
I think what's interesting, you pointed out before that the fandoms get the pop culture references like Buffy and Star Wars and stuff, and they haven't, apart from the film, there hasn't been a lot of presence in modern day cinema or television. I mean, how wonderful would it be if we had a Phantom series that sort of came to life to bring Phantom into modern day times and give it some life itself in this current climate?
And I think personally, it's got like limitless appeal, because if you want to have a TV show or a movie, you can dip back through history. You know, you can have like a
nearly 100 years worth of stories to tap into.
Well, yeah, 500. So you know, you can do.
I meant like in real time.
It's like casual. Yeah, so if you want to do like a Wild West themed episode of a TV show, there it is, or a whole movie, or you know, Gaslight era. You know, it's up for grabs. Your surname is Walker, is it?
Definitely.
Oh, just checking, Chris. With my favourite issue, mine often surprises people, because my favourite story is a story, a European story called The Beanstalk, and it's on no one's favourite list. But to me personally, it was one of the first issues I had. And just so you know, just so you're aware, the way that The Phantom is being published in Australia, it's not sequential. Like they didn't print them in the correct order. So you might go down to the newsagent and buy a story, and it might be 80 years old, and then the next one might be 20 years old, and the next one might be brand new. And so the first few Phantoms I read, the first one I actually ever read was a story about the 19th Phantom. And so I didn't really get what was going on. I didn't know why it was set back in the past. And then the next one I read, the Phantom had a girlfriend. And then the next one he had a wife and 2 kids. Like, it was just sort of all over the place. But The Beanstalk was a story about a young man who was stolen from. He was the son of a chief, but he didn't realise. He was the son of a chief who was stolen by another chief from a different tribe who was envious, and he just took him to Morristown and just put him at someone's doorbell. And this kid had experienced this terrible life where he ended up out on the street and ended up being involved in gangs, but he always had this moral code, and he ended up in prison, and the Phantom comes to visit him in prison as Mr. Walker. And I think that might have been the first time I'd seen Mr. Walker in a comic as well. And I thought, this guy looks fantastic, you know. But it was the characterisation of the Phantom in that particular story that really got me. And I've tried with my stories to make that the way the Phantom is. Like, he's fair and he's compassionate. And so that story, even though like most people wouldn't have really, might not know about the story at all, it's not like a famous story. It's just, in my opinion, the quintessential Phantom personality shining through. And yeah, if you get a chance to get out and read it.
I think that's maybe because there was an animated Phantom series called Phantom 2040, which I'm sure people in the audience have seen before, but it's from the 90s. It was done by the guy who did Aeon Flux, so it has that very specific style where human biology is like, there's a lot of artistic liberty to it, right? Everyone kind of, yeah, people move like spiders, it's fucked, but cool. And that was set in the future, and climate change has happened, and the virtual reality is a big part of it, but it was a really, I think, clever adaptation of the source material, trying to adapt it for an audience who wouldn't be familiar with the character, but at the same time acknowledging the people who had followed that character all the way through. And I think that's like a realistic concept for a show now, because if you were doing that live action purely just because of the set pieces, it makes it so expensive. But that thing that the Phantom has with like the 500 years worth of stories, right? That's what I think is so rich potentially from a television point of view, like an anthology series where you can have an episode that's truly Walker, or you can like dip into those other Phantoms and get to explore that, or you can have like a Guran bottle episode or something. That's the sort of stuff that my main job, like what I pay my bills with, is I work as a screenwriter, and if I was pitching a show, I think that's how I would pitch it, because from a modern lens, like we know the Phantom is more than just a white guy in the jungle. In particular, there's a huge difference between like a Tarzan, king of the jungle, who rules the jungle, and a Phantom type who is part of the jungle, who adopts the mentality and ethics and code and belief system of the people of Bengal, who he's grown up around. And so his fathers and so on and so forth. So trying to bring people in and not exclude people would be the way that I would think to do it, because there are so many variations to that story that seems like the gold line to me.
I'm just going to ask you as well, like, some people consider the Phantom problematic because it was written so long ago, and you know the theme of the jungle was so popular back then, and you know, and it's borrowed from Burroughs as well, of Tarzan and things like that. And you know, there's a lot of sensitivity now about that, and some people want to give that whole thing a wide berth. Do you think it's better to embrace that, or how would you go about doing it?
Well, I kind of always thought the way, if you were trying to do the Phantom two ways. The 1996 film, I think, is clever by setting it in the period. Seems really clever to me because it's like you're viewing everything through that lens. I think the film is supposed to be set in 1941 or something like that, right? But I sort of always think about the way you would do it now is to make the Phantom black. You know what I mean? Make the Phantom somebody who was from the Bengali tribe, and for whatever reason there wasn't a male heir for that son, or like the Walker line gets exterminated or something like that, right? And that is the way you sort of bring it into the fold, or you just have to find a way to sort of break down those borders. But it is really fascinating because the Phantom, you know, you mentioned Burroughs, right? For sure was a product of its time, right? So it comes out in 1936. And that's sort of like the peak era of adventure stories, your Zorros, your Shadows, your all that kind of stuff. And the Phantom already, story-wise, compared to other things at the time, not that this is like Ganymedes, but like least racist, least sexist, particularly the sexism stuff. Like Diana Palmer is like boxing, you know, in the first issues.
In the first panel of the first issue, she's punching the first mate.
Legit. And so it's like that stuff is so interesting and progressive. And it like speaks to like Lee Falk's interests in different types of women and things like vaudeville stars and the types of women. Like there was this silent film actress called Clara Bow, who was really famous for this part called Roughhouse Rosie, and she was like the big movie star at the time. But her whole thing was like she always played these like lousy broads who would be punching on people, and she was somebody who got discovered on the street in a fight with someone when she was 17. So you know what I mean? It's just like incredible shit where like the subtextual meets the textual. But when as the Phantom progressed, I think one of the reasons the Phantom has survived and most other comics from pre-Golden Age or around that period haven't is because the Phantom evolved and grew. And so you have that, obviously, with the shift of artists from, you know, Ray Moore and to Wilson McCoy to Cy Barry, but also the types of stories that are being told. And as things like Lee Falk casting a black Othello, Paul Robeson, in his stage play version of Othello, as that's happening in the 40s, right in the middle of when like segregation still exists and like it's illegal in America for there to be interracial marriages, and then on stage he's casting a black man as Othello and a white woman as the lead, and so that becomes controversial. He's pushing the boundaries there. You start to see it shift in the story as well. And Cy Barry had his whole, he was younger, you know, he was like a good solid almost 20 to 30 years younger than Lee, so he's even thinking about things more differently and progressive. He grows up in New York, which is a very multicultural city. And so you see the Phantom start to shift as things around him, like American civil rights movement, second wave feminism, all that stuff comes into play. So I think that's sort of how I would do it, is to progress. Because I just think like, I don't know, I don't feel like it serves anybody to hold things from 1936 to the standards of 2022, you know? It doesn't make any sense. You don't know what you don't know until you know it, you know? Probably thought we would all be in flying cars by now. I mean, hashtag same, but...
Well, I've always felt for a long time that the Phantom's like 2 minutes away from being cancelled. But it is up to like the new writers now. Yeah. And I think like Tony and Paul, I don't know if you get
I know.
he's making real efforts to really recognise and celebrate, different cultures, even though like they're fictional cultures.
Yeah.
But I like that idea too about having, Phantom somewhere along the line marry a black woman because these characters, they live in this country, they grow up surrounded by these people, but they always end up marrying a white woman.
And you got to get them from the mainland. It's so stupid. But that would also be a perfect example of like the meshing of the two cultures. You know what I mean? Like this is part of the reason that there's such a huge global black fandom for the Phantom, is because this character resonates with Indigenous communities globally, because he's somebody who lives among the community, who looks after the land, believes in the value system, all these things that are like traditionally Indigenous value systems. That's why that character resonates. So that would be an even smarter way, I guess, to mesh the two stories together. It would make a lot of sense.
I think one of the things that's interesting to me is that these days we look at things like back in the 90s, 80s, George Lucas created Star Wars. You look at these old, the pop culture stuff where the original directors bring to life this story. You fast forward it to current time, and these new directors who are fans of the original source are now giving their own twist on how they perceive that story. So I guess in the Phantom world, how do you think that is relevant now for the new writers to stay true to the original source without becoming too much fan fiction of their own creation?
I think that's me. That's me right here. And also you might say Duncan as well in the front row here. We are both super fans of the Phantom, and I'm very conscious of staying true to the original vision. And what's interesting with the Phantom, like unlike Star Wars, where Lucas made those films and then returned to that universe and made those prequels, which were tonally very different, and some people despised them and some people liked them. With the Phantom, Lee Falk wrote that thing for decades.
Yeah, 60 plus years. That's crazy.
And I mean, I could talk all day about that. Like, I should just stick to your. I want to go on a tangent for a second.
Go on a tangent.
I'd love to get your opinion on this.
Love a tangent.
And my friends here have heard this from 100 times. I can't criticise Lee Falk because he had this spectacular idea. And you alluded to Buffy the Vampire Slayer before, and I hadn't ever thought about this before you mentioned in the podcast. That Buffy may exist because of this legacy idea which was introduced by Lee Falk. I just wonder, in a different universe, in a parallel universe, where Lee Falk would have aged the Phantom in real time and had him marry Diana in real time and have the kids in the 40s and they grow up in the 50s and take on the mantle in the 60s, and then the original Phantom dies, or for a change he retires or joins them on their adventures. And then we'd be in a position now where we'd be up to like the 25th or something with Phantom. Isn't it?
And you say that
Isn't my point good?
it's like watching The Simpsons, it's been over 30 years and yet they don't age.
Well, here's the thing.
It's like the Robins, though. You think about it, like Batman always has to, quote unquote, always has to be Bruce Wayne, right? That's well, not always, but like majority of the time, the everyday person on the street knows Bruce Wayne is Batman. But the Robins always shift, like whether it's like a Tim Drake or whatever. The Robin character seems to be able to be transitional, whereas the Batman not so much. Although to be fair, like Damian Wayne did play Batman for a period of time as well. But yeah, that's a really, really good point.
And when they rebooted, the New 52, and they sort of implied that this universe has been going for 5 years, but Batman's already on his fifth Robin, and there's already Nightwing. I just think, and this is actually part of my point. Like the Punisher and Batman, they're always retconning. Like the Punisher's no longer a Vietnam vet. He went to Desert Storm. Oh no, that's too far away. Then he went to Iraq. Oh no. Now he went to he was a CIA operative. And with the Phantom is the only character that wouldn't have had that problem if Lee Falk had foresight. And I can't expect too much of the man. That would have been very, very progressive thinking back then. But one thing that gets me with the Phantom is you read a story where the Phantom's in the 70s in Vietnam, and you think, which Phantom is this? You know, and you read a story where the Phantom, you know, meets Diana in the 30s.
Yeah.
But then you read another story where he was born in 1945, and you read another story where, you know...
Well, like the early origin story, he's the first Phantom is the descendant of like an English nobleman, and then they shift that to make it more Americanized and to really centralize the story. But it is really interesting, and I wonder, so you say like if we had the shifting Phantoms, maybe that means it keeps it current. But the other thing is maybe it means that the Phantom doesn't get to exist because people get really attached to different versions of that character, and if they felt like it was shifting every 10 to 20 years, maybe, because there was that period in the sort of like the 50s and 60s where comics were just dying in the arse, you know, it was like sort of before, like if you went Fantastic Four or Spider-Man, these characters that had been there from the beginning were just disappearing. And it's always really interesting, especially I think in the context of the podcast coming out, and like doing interviews with press and talking to people, and they're like, you know, why do you think the Phantom isn't well known as other characters? And I was like, well, I think that really depends on who you're talking to and what you define, or they say, why do you think the Phantom isn't as successful as other characters? And I'm like, define success, because being the first superhero and you're still published today, that's success to me. And you're still published globally, that's success. Okay, sure, you haven't had Ben Affleck and George Clooney and Val Kilmer and Robert Pattinson and Adam West and, you know, whatever, Michael Keaton play you in several different film versions. But that's for right now, you know what I mean? Like I genuinely do believe that all it's going to take is the right adaptation, because that's genuinely how you have character longevity now, is you have to have cross-platform media infiltration. I'm talking games, I'm talking comics, I'm talking novelizations, all of that. You know how bloody hard it is to get Phantom merch? Oh my god, I had to have a friend to make me these earrings custom, you know? Edenki and Artist Alley, go check her store.
I'm not really a fan of this particular franchise, but this is where I think... No, I don't mean the Phantom. I'm not a Doctor Who fan.
Right.
But the one thing I can appreciate for the Doctor Who fandom is that they are progressive in the sense that once a Doctor's time is done, they then hand the torch on to somebody else, and that story evolves into that current Doctor's way of thinking and how they are.
And
that's progression.
Yeah.
And a new cast of supporting characters.
It's a great inbuilt mechanism because it means the show can shift with the times in a way that, but it's also shifting with the times, ... But whatever this is, it's not forever. So if you don't like this particular Doctor, don't worry, there'll be a new one in 5 to 6 years or whatever.
And that's the thing too, it's in Doctor Who, at the end of each of their stories, they hand the torch over to become a new Doctor. Whereas with other series and stuff, they just get rid of one character and just rewrite them and reform them, where this is a constantly changing character with their own story, but it all just follows on. And that's what I think would be great for the Phantom.
I think there's a possibility of doing that as well, because like the 21st Phantom is the one we've had since the 30s, and everyone loves it, and no one wants to see this character come to any harm. But at the moment, I think Kid and Heloise have never been so popular. The children of the Phantom, and they're getting more and more adventures, and it seems to be that the newspaper script is really focusing on them, and it's sort of it's setting them up for this gradual transition. And I think, you know, you were saying before that people love the character. If Lee Falk had if kids had have grown up with Kid and Heloise, and then one of them became a Phantom, that would be that generation's Phantom. You know, like the kids in the 70s would have known the 22nd or the 23rd Phantom. And that, you know, and that even that is so generational. So what's happening in reality, fathers and sons and daughters and grandfathers all enjoying the Phantom, it would actually be paralleling in the comic universe.
Yeah.
Does any of the audience have any questions? Want to come up and ask?
Pressure.
If not, it's okay. We'll keep going.
Kevin, come on, mate. I can see a little head thinking.
So is there anything else apart from, is there anything that, we're obviously Phantom fanatics, but is there anything else that sort of, that helps, I guess, make you passionate about the fandom? Is there other fandoms you enjoy that you can see, I guess, that could be inspired by the Phantom that we are.
Everything. It's so wild because I think I can find anything interesting if I try hard enough. It's like the best thing about journalism is like, I started as a police reporter, right, but you would still have to cover general news. So you'd literally be covering like a double murder one day, and the next day they'd be like, right, you're off to a schnauzer meetup. And you're like, what the fuck? Like, what is this? It's like, you're going to find that interesting. You're like, oh man. I was like, and these people love these dogs. Cool. Don't you love these dogs? And it's
Got mustaches.
yeah. But, so it means that now, like as someone in my 30s, I can find anything interesting the longer I sort of dig into it. And I've always found the Phantom interesting and enjoyable from like a consumer perspective. But then when the Phantom Never Dies got greenlit by Nova, which to me was so wild because it's the only podcast on their network, respectfully, that doesn't have someone from The Bachelor or Bachelorette on it. Like all the other hosts are legit from Survivor or Australian Idol or Bachelor or Bachelorette, and I'm like, hi, I love pop culture scholarship, and let's talk about the mechanics of storytelling anyway. But the thing that was really interesting was you're telling this story, you're trying to bring people into the show, into the world of Phantom, who might never have heard of this character before and have no interest in it. But at the same time, people who do know a bunch of stuff who want to come on this journey as well. So you tell it chronologically because that makes the most sense, right? But as we would get, and everybody knows those stories about like World War II and Norwegian resistance movements being inspired by the Phantom, and stories of Fellini making bootleg Phantom comics and bootleg Mandrake the Magician comics to feed his family. Stuff that's like amazing, it's a fucking amazing story. But you also start connecting the dots to other stuff, and you're like, the Buffy thing you mentioned before, for instance. So for those who don't know, in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the whole conceit of the Slayer is into every generation the Slayer is born. She alone stand against the forces of darkness. She is the Slayer. And so it's this idea of a generational duty that gets passed on from one to the other, only in the event of a death, which is literally what the Phantom does. It's like the oath of the skull, my sons and their sons should fight greed, piracy, injustice in all its forms. And something like that, though I don't think there would be much connection between Buffy and Buffy and the Phantom. They would maybe go more, obviously, the Phantom and Batman, because Batman is literally created because the Phantom is becoming so successful. And even stuff like the term serial killer, for instance, that is the guy who invented that term, Robert Bresler, who worked in the behavioural sciences unit at the FBI. He was a massive fan of the Phantom growing up, and at the time when they were starting the BSU, they were using the term sequence killers and stranger killers, not serial killers. But he didn't feel like the term was necessarily correct, and so he was thinking about it in the context of his favourite serial, which was the 1943 Columbia Pictures Phantom serial, where you had to come back each week to get the next installment of the story. And that was how he thought about serial killers, because they had to keep returning to the crime, returning to try and recreate the event. And it's like, we literally had the term serial killer because the Phantom was a thing that existed, So there's just like lots of stuff like that where the pop cultural tendrils of the character in big ways and small ways have just like rippled through time, that I think it's really important to talk about, because I don't know, I'm sure we've all had those conversations with people who maybe aren't big pop culture people and say, well, pop culture doesn't really matter, or like comics don't really matter, or stories don't really matter. And it's like, no, those stories and those characters and people telling those stories, that echoes out into ways that you can't even imagine, especially a character from 1936 that still hangs around.
It's interesting that you were just talking about the serial stuff. I remember when I was a little kid, and my grandparents every Sunday would be like, here's 20 cents to go get the Sunday mail. And the one thing they used to love doing was coming back, and in just 4 or 5 little sequences, each week they went from they just created this massive little story in just such a short amount of frames, and each week you had to come back to see what the Phantom was going to do. How was he going to get out of what their damn frame was, and you were like, I can't wait for next time, I need to know what's going to happen. And they did that so well, where every single week they would leave you on a cliffhanger. And I think that was fantastic of how they were able to just capture 5 or 6 little frames and keep you on the edge of your seat every single time.
Well, think about it in the context of Papua New Guinea, where the character is the most popular character in Papua New Guinea is the Phantom, still to this day, right? And there are lots of different theories about why that is. One of them is that a plane crashes in a remote part of Papua New Guinea during World War II, and on that plane are Phantom comics that the Allies have, and that's the first time people get access to it. But that's unverifiable, it's just kind of like a cute little urban legend. But the genuine theory is that in the 70s, people start coming across from Australia into Papua New Guinea. They bring with them Phantom comics, which are obviously hugely popular here, hugely popular in the Torres Strait. And for the first time, Papua New Guinea in mass is getting exposed to the Phantom. And then it starts getting translated into the most popular dialect, which is Tok Pisin, which is essentially like Pidgin. And so people can access that comic in their language. And the character is called the Ghost Who Walks, and in Papua New Guinean culture, when you die, if you come back as a ghost, your skin is white. So they interpreted it literally as he's one of us, he's a black fella. And all the characters around him are black, and it's set in the jungle, in a specific geographical terrain that looks very similar to Papua New Guinea. So that was them. That was their story, and that was the first time they got to see versions of themselves represented. And it's important too because it's Cy Barry's art, and the way Cy Barry drew characters of colour was very different to earlier Phantom artists, and the impact that that has. And then when the 1989 Papua New Guinean Civil War comes along, they're going into battle with these tribal shields that are literally like 7 and 8 feet tall, and the strongest warrior of every tribe will have the Phantom painted on the front of their shields. Like, that's bananas. That's like, you tell somebody that story, that sounds like, and then you see the damn things. I'm sure, like, I don't know, maybe, has anyone seen? Yeah, they're fucking crazy. Sorry, this child knows. They're crazy. They're truly just unbelievable. And like that idea of tribal pop art, which is the curatorial term, it's just nuts.
That's iconic cultural symbolism, isn't it?
It is truly just absolutely the way that infiltrated. It's just like the Coca-Cola symbol and the Phantom.
That's right. It's not Superman's logo. It's not Batman. It's not Wonder Woman. It's this character which in our culture is, you know, disappearing, and that's, I think, due to the lack of merchandise. It
genuinely, like, I don't know, it took me like a year and a half before I could find a way to get a hold of a Phantom t-shirt. Like, the 2 Phantom t-shirts I had were both vintage, so it's like, even then, it's like, you can't wash those things. They're like, half the space is peeling off, there's a bloodstain effect that you don't ask any questions about, or, you know, they were things that I had to like genuinely like hunt down and source. And like,
I've got such regrets because, you know, in the late 80s and 90s when I first started collecting, you know, every comic had ads for t-shirts, and I never had one. You know, they just always seemed so expensive to me because I was just a kid, so I never had one. And now, like, yeah, they're rare.
So hard. I bought a Phantom film crew shirt on Amazon that I was like in a bidding battle with someone in Wisconsin for like months, and I was like, I'm getting hold of this damn crew shirt, so help me. But it sounds so silly, but it really is like a basic thing, like being able to access a Phantom t-shirt or a Phantom hat really means the character's face and iconography and image penetrates in a way that it just like, for instance, I had a manicure once where I had each of my individual nails was painted with the Phantom. I was on the tram and I was holding onto the pole, and there was a lady kind of like across the tram, and she was Indian, and the Phantom is humongous in India, as everybody knows. And she literally got up on the tram and she's like, excuse me, that's the Phantom drawn on your nail, isn't it? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, started telling me this huge story about how her and her family are massive Phantom fans, and like her dad got her into it, and it was this huge thing. And it's like, if that iconography is not somewhere visually where people can see it, you don't have that conversation, you know?
And I always think about like my own kids. They're exposed to like the Marvel DC characters on a daily basis, and even from when they're little, you know, it's on lunch bags and pencil cases and rubber stationery. It's everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And they first get to know Batman and his personality through cartoons, and then eventually movies. And there's just there's one source of Phantom.
Yeah.
There was the cartoon, obviously, the Defenders of the Earth.
Defenders. That theme song. Defenders of the Earth.
Even that, this is something we discussed numerous times. We just wish that the owners of the IP were doing more.
Yeah.
I cannot believe we almost have to wrap up. This has been an enjoyable panel, but as someone who's a casual reader, I collect toys and review them and stuff like that. I do have a Phantom hotline. Now I've noticed that there's a red one and a purple one, and there's an Australian exclusive which is grey. Can you tell us the difference between the coloured suits of the Phantom and why it's not just one colour, the purple?
Well, it's like a licensing thing. Back in the day, you could essentially acquire the license from King Features to publish in your country, which meant that you could change the colour of your Phantom to make it specific and unique to you. So different countries would have different coloured Phantoms, and it's actually really interesting on those Papua New Guinean war shields I was talking about. Depending on what region of Papua New Guinea, it's usually the Western Highlands, but depending on what region they come from, some of their Phantoms will all be brown, so they're reading New Zealand Phantom comics. And some of them will be blue, and some of them, so as the colours change, and it's not just a pigment thing, over time they age, it's you can tell it's a specific art thing. You can say, oh, that person's got access to that Phantom, or that Phantom. And in some cases, it's the red and yellow suit, and the skin's black. So they're drawing Condo Man, which was the HIV/AIDS awareness character that was targeted at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and was based on the Phantom. And so they're drawing that on their shields, making the connection that's the Phantom to us. And so that kind of stuff is just, anyway, I don't know if I summarised that quickly. But
Very well, yeah. And that's wild too,
funny.
because those characters are also the Brazil characters, but he's white in Brazil.
Well, based on that answer, I know the Australian version was grey, because when they released the toy, it was with a grey outfit and it had Australian exclusives.
Well, that was his intention, is the character was supposed to be called the Grey Ghost, and then there was a mistake kind of in the inking process, and Lee Falk wasn't there, and it went to print purple with the blue and black striped trunks, and it's c'est la vie, he's purple now, which I'm kind of so glad he is, because it's an iconic outfit. There aren't many others, I can't think of many other superheroes.
And it's such good jungle camouflage.
Oh my god, such a good point. Imagine in the jungle and you're holy shit, there's a huge guy over there in a purple suit with a pet wolf and a white stallion perched in a tree.
I was going to say, if it was green or browns or something and you sort of fit into the background, no worries, but bright purple in the middle where purple isn't really a primary colour in the jungle, it's
there's a good thing though.
Giant purple man, tree.
If you were adapting it into source material in the show or film or whatever, I reckon I would make it a variable costume, so it's a nice little wink to the history of the Phantom, so it's changing based on his surroundings, but when you're not needing it to activate colours, I would have it in purple all the time, and then when he's out in the jungle, it changes, and so that's stealth mode.
Water mode.
Invisible, it's just his little face.
Well, it's funny you say invisible, because in X-Men, they can press a button and the outside panels flip and it becomes glass and they look invisible. So
Wonder Woman, invisible jet.
yeah, exactly.
How do you find it?
Yeah.
All right, we've got time for one more question. If anyone's got a question for the panel, or you want to close the panel out with this.
I want one question each.
Yeah. Yay! Oh my god, up the bag! Yeah.
Hello. All right, close us out with a big question.
I don't really need a mic, do I?
Yeah.
I'll take it. I have read very little, but my dad on his wall has a framed certificate that says that he's officially a member of his local chapter of the Phantom Fan Club.
Yeah.
So, questions: does that still exist? And if so, what's the interaction like, and do the writers communicate with those sort of groups frequently, and that sort of thing?
I'm going to leave this mainly to Matt, but I will tell you the Phantom Fan Club story. when it first launched in Australia, there was so much negative press about it. The press was calling them freaks, these phantom freaks, but like PH freaks, right? So it's actually kind of a clever literary joke, but whatever. Anyway, they were like, these phantom freaks and their phantom freaky club. And to counteract the negative press, they leaked some of the names of their celebrity members, which included Wally Lewis. And this was like right in the 80s, so it was like peak Wally Lewis time. And so Lincoln, obviously Wally's son, who's here this weekend, when Wally, he passed on all his Phantom comics and collection onto Lincoln's brother Mitch. And so all the collection now belongs to the sons. And he was like one of the OG sort of famous Phantom fan club members in Australia. Even had a Wally Lewis Phantom training card. And there was a whole Wally Lewis Phantom Tuies campaign as well. I highly recommend. Yeah, fine, have a look at my Instagram. It's like the 4th or 5th picture. A bunch of Phantom fans had the archive copies and sent it to me. I was like, oh my God, it's amazing.
I can't really add much to that. I've never been a member of it. I do know that people like Wally Lewis and Paul Hogan, they've been high-profile Phantom fans, and the Phantom was much more popular, and there was much more exposure to the Phantom in the media back in the 70s and 80s.
There's also a rapper called French Montana. Not sure if you're familiar with French Montana's work.
Is that Hannah's brother?
Is it what?
Hannah's brother?
No, tragically no. First of all, he's black, so no. But he has an album out, his latest album out at the moment has a little Phantom verse that says, I can get Ghost, be the Phantom. And I was like, oh, that's like the first young kind of Phantom fan that I've heard pop culturally in ages. I was like, oh my God, is French Montana a Phantom fan? Yes, he is, but it's just so weird the different ways that will infiltrate into pop culture.
Awesome. So look, before we wrap up, you said you'd have Instagram. Do you want to plug your Instagram and where they can find you, Matt?
I'll plug the podcast. It's called The Phantom Never Dies. It's a 6-part audio documentary. You can subscribe to it on all your chosen podcast platform forms. If you know anybody who's hearing impaired but would still like to enjoy the show, in the show notes we have full transcriptions for every episode so they can read along. We speak to as many people as we can about the Phantom and sort of chart the pop cultural history and echoes and things.
I love it. I really love it. I've been fascinated by this. And even now, sitting next to you, I feel like I'm sitting next to the Phantom Wiki.
Dude, the Phantom Wiki, can somebody get on there and figure that out? Because it is hard to navigate, because it's obviously different countries and different fandoms will each do their own, and then there's specific ones, and anyway.
We need a Phantopedia.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that. Again, a huge shout out to Sean for recording that for us. And being a roving Melbourne reporter. And Sean's done this a couple of times. So thank you, Sean. Thank you to Matt and Marie for agreeing to let us be able to put this panel discussion onto a podcast. And hopefully you, the fans, enjoyed that. Now, if you did, please, you can follow us on our website, which is chroniclechamber.com. Our email is chroniclechamber@gmail.com. We're all over social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, and we're, of course, on Instagram. You can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, and the various other apps. And that is all from me. Until next time, happy phantoming and stay safe.
The sole survivor of a shipwreck, and upon the skull of the man who killed his dad, he said, I'm mad, I must eradicate piracy, injustice and cruelty, and all my sons will follow me, so evildoers will believe that this man cannot die.
The Phantom,
The ghost who walked.
the Phantom,
Enemies beware, the Phantom's always there, but you won't mind the Phantom. He fights